The spire of Drexelus loomed like a blade thrust into the sky, its tiers glowing pale silver against a horizon smeared with industrial ash. And beneath its ordered brilliance sprawled the Junkyard, a labyrinth of twisted scaffolds, rust-eaten beams, and discarded ration crates where the unwanted of the city clung to life like weeds growing through cracks in stone. The air was sharp with the bite of corroded metal and the sour stench of spoiled rations, every gust lifting dust that cut the throat and settled into the lungs. And within this wreckage, Neri crouched with her daughter, the fire she fed with scraps of insulation throwing a weak, unsteady glow across their corner of ruin. Once she had worn silk veils and silver cords as a ceremonial attendant of an Arini enclave, her days measured by ritual and precision. But the enclave's debts had stripped everything from her, leaving her here with only pride and a child whose life was her single remaining vow. Len, small for her 6 years, sat pressed against her side, turquoise eyes bright in the dim light, though her violet skin had dulled and her green hair hung in knots bound with cloth strips. And she made no sound, for she had learned silence was the only shield children could carry in places where words made you pray. Neri's hand never strayed far from the jagged scrap of metal she used as a blade, and every echo in the shifting yard tightened her muscles. For the memory of men who came with promises of food, only to demand her body in return, was carved too deep to forget. When footsteps crunched down the broken tiles of the lane, deliberate and unhurried, she drew Len behind her and set her jaw for another confrontation. But the figure that emerged into the weak firelight was different tall, human, his work shirt rolled to the elbows, boots scuffed with ash, hands raised open and empty as he lowered a canvas bag onto the ground. Neri's first thought was trap, her second was insult. For who brought food without expectation, in a world that punished generosity as weakness? Yet the man crouched, tapped the flask once, and said simply, root broth, grain cake, clean water. His tone was clipped, almost like a report, as if he were reciting inventory rather than offering charity, and then he stepped back, giving her space, his gray eyes steady, but not intruding. She held his stare, waiting for the bargain to surface, but he only nodded once, turned, and walked back into the shadows until the sound of his boots was swallowed by the wind. Neri did not move, not until her daughter whispered, "Thank you," into the empty night, the words so soft yet cutting her deeper than hunger, because gratitude meant ties and ties meant danger. And still when she unsealed the flask and the steam of broth rose warm into the cold air, she let Len sip first, watching her daughter's eyes flutter closed with something that looked almost like peace. Later, when the fire burned low and sleep refused her, Neri turned the question again and again in her mind. Why had the man come? What did he see in them? What cost would he claim when the time came? And yet, beneath all her suspicions, a quieter thought took root like a weed in cracked stone. If he had meant harm, he had already had his chance. That thought frightened her more than the storm winds, for it carried a possibility she could not allow herself to believe. That compassion was not waste, but defiance, and that in the shadow of Drexel's spire, someone had chosen to see her and her child as more than scraps left to rot. Rain began before dusk, first a fine mist that settled like grease on metal and skin, then a steady downpour that turned dust into clinging mud and made the air taste of rust and ozone. And as the sky dimmed, the Junkyard became a hollow echo chamber where each drip and clatter sounded like footsteps, a place where fear multiplied with every gust. Neri huddled with Len behind their weak fire, the girl's shawl soaked through, her small body shivering with the fever that had risen in the night, and each cough from her chest was a knife in Neri's ribs, reminding her how thin the line was between survival and loss. She kept the fire low to avoid smoke, teeth clenched against the cold, and when footsteps came again from the left path, she gripped the shard of metal tighter, her mind already bracing for the cost men demanded in rain and darkness. But when the figure stepped into view, it was the same human as before, boots heavy with mud, a dark coat on his shoulders, water dripping from his hair, and in his hand the same canvas bag carried like an oath. He did not speak over the storm, only crouched and set down his burden 2 sealed flasks, a wrapped loaf, a small tin marked with a red stripe, and a folded gray cloth dry and clean, and Neri's breath caught at the sight of the stripe. Her first thought medicine, her second a leash disguised as kindness. She kept Len behind her, body shielding her child, eyes never leaving the man as he said evenly, "Storm will run through the night. Lower drains are backing up. This lane will flood. You'll be cut off." Neri spat back. "We've handled worse," but he nodded at the girl and said, "You have." "She hasn't." His voice was flat, not pleading, and when Len peeked out with hair plastered to her face to whisper, "What's in the tin?" he opened it without hesitation to show pale powder. "Mineral drink for fever," he said. "Tastes bad. Helps." The storm rattled panels around them, and Neri felt the pull of hunger and fear against her pride, testing the edges of her suspicion. "Why?" she demanded, her throat raw. "Why do you do this?" He reached into his coat and pulled a black badge, scratched and faded from use, stamped with an intake seal. "I audit storage and waste," he said. "I sign numbers. Some of those numbers should be people." The words were not a speech, only a fact. And still she did not believe, not fully, until he broke the seal on one flask, drank deeply, tore the bread, and ate without flinching as rain streaked his face. "If I fall over, don't copy me," he said dryly, and Len let out a laugh that cracked into a cough, her body trembling in Neri's arms, and that sound, more than any logic, decided it. Neri asked through clenched teeth, "How far is your door?" 8 minutes if she walks. 5 if I carry her," he answered. When she pressed him again, "Will anyone stop us?" he shook his head. "The walkway is empty in storms. I live alone." The last line carried weight, answering one fear while raising others, but Neri studied his eyes, saw only steadiness. And when Len whispered, "Mama, I'm cold," the choice was made. She lifted her daughter and handed her over, her chest aching at how little she weighed, and Miles received her with practiced ease, one hand at her thighs, one steady at her back, the child's small fingers curling into his coat as if they belonged there. "Stay on my left," he said, already turning toward the lane, where floodwater churned in the dark. And with no other path left, Neri followed into the storm, her heart hammering at the thought that she was not just stepping into water, but into something far more dangerous, the possibility of trust. The storm drove them hard, water rising in brown currents around their knees as they picked their way through the scrap-choked lanes. Every step a gamble against the pull of the flood, but Miles moved with the steadiness of someone used to carrying burdens, his boots finding solid ground, his arm never faltering beneath Len's small weight, while Neri copied his steps with grim determination, each slip steadied by a brief, firm touch that he released the instant her footing returned. By the time they reached the service stair, the junkyard behind them was half drowned, fires sputtering out in the deluge, shadows of scavengers huddled under frames too afraid or too proud to follow, and the climb itself was slick with algae and rust, but Miles scaled it one-handed, shifting Len against his side as if her weight was nothing, then offering Neri a palm without looking down at her body, only at her boots on the rung. They emerged onto a narrow catwalk tucked against the spire's concrete underbelly, the roar of rain dulled to a steady drum above them, and for the first time Neri felt the storm fall away, replaced by the hum of vents and the faint warmth of recycled air pressing out from hidden intakes. Len shivered and tucked deeper against his coat, and he adjusted his grip without being asked, the motion so instinctive it made Neri's chest ache. At a recessed door with a single blinking lock light, He pressed his chip badge to the plate, and the lock clicked open. He stepped aside, letting her enter first. And what waited inside was so different from the yard that for a heartbeat she thought it a trap. One room divided by a low partition, hydroponic trays glowing with pale leaves, shelves lined with folded clothes and ration logs, a bench and a narrow bed, air warm and smelling faintly of boiled roots and clean water. Miles laid Len gently on the bench, stripped off his wet coat, and moved with a quiet order that unsettled her more than chaos water on a burner. Powder measured into a cup, temperature tested against his wrist before he pressed it toward the child. Len wrinkled her nose, but drank in small sips, her fever-bright eyes softening with each swallow. And Neri stood near the door rigid, wet wraps clinging to her skin, waiting for the cost to show. Instead, Miles placed a folded shirt and towel on the counter, turned his back to her, and said simply, "Dry clothes." "I won't look." Suspicion warred with exhaustion, and she waited, testing, but he kept his eyes on the coil flame until she slipped into the oversized shirt, warm against her cold skin, carrying only the faint scent of soap and dried greens. When she pressed her daughter's forehead, Len's skin was still hot but steadier, and Miles's voice came again, calm and even. "Eat, warm up, sleep. No debt. If you leave in the morning, you leave. If you stay, we set the rules together." Neri's jaw tightened, her pride demanding she ask, "And what rules would you set?" He listed them as if reciting inventory. "Lock the door. No guests. Food is shared. I don't touch unless you say, or unless you're falling." It was too clean, too plain. No hidden bargain she could seize on. And that clarity was more dangerous than any threat, because it left the choice with her. As Len drifted into sleep, curled in a blanket that smelled of nothing but warmth, Neri realized the most unsettling truth. The man had given her the one thing no one else in the yard ever had. A choice. And she did not yet know whether she was strong enough to take it. Morning crept through the narrow seam of glass in a pale, muted light, softened by clouds still heavy from the storm. And for the first time in months, Neri did not wake with a jolt of panic, but with the disorienting sensation of warmth. Her daughter's small body curled against her side beneath a blanket that smelled faintly of clean cloth and hydroponic leaves instead of smoke and rot. The hum of nutrient trays filled the silence, steady and low. And across the small room, Miles moved with the same calm order he had shown the night before. Sleeves rolled, hair still damp, measuring dried greens into a pot and checking the coil flame with the precision of a man who lived in rhythms, rather than chaos. Neri sat up slowly, the oversized shirt slipping against her thighs, her eyes following every motion with suspicion, sharpened by unease, because comfort itself felt like the trap she had been warned of all her life. Len stirred and blinked sleepily at the glow of the trays, whispering, "It's warm," with a kind of awe that tore at Neri's chest. And when Miles placed bowls of pale broth before them without flourish, eating from the same pot himself before they touched theirs, the defenses she had built like armor cracked one line further. She asked him the questions she could not keep down. Why risk credits for strangers? Why ignore the system like everyone else? Why choose them when he had no reason? And his answers came blunt, without decoration. "Because I remember what it felt like when people looked through me." And when he said it, his gray eyes steady, Neri heard not pity, but memory hardened into fact. Len's quiet voice broke the silence again, naming him with the blunt honesty only children carried. "He feels like a wall. Nothing can push him." Neri's throat tightened, because walls could collapse, walls could bury. And yet, for the first time since her exile, she was not planning which path she would take to run. Instead, she found herself measuring tomorrow, what her daughter's cough might sound like, whether the hydroponic trays would still glow at night, whether the man would still move with the same steadiness when she asked him questions meant to test his patience. That realization terrified her, more than hunger or rain ever had, because survival had always meant bracing for loss. And now she felt the first dangerous pull of wanting something more than scraps. In the charged quiet of that morning, watching Miles rinse the bowls with the same deliberate care he gave to his reports, Mary understood the truth she had been resisting. The danger was not that he would betray her. The danger was that he would not. The second night carried a weight that had nothing to do with rain or hunger, but with the silence that pressed between them like a held breath. The storm outside gone, and only the hum of hydroponics and the faint glow of leaves filling the room. Len had fallen asleep quickly, cheeks no longer flushed with fever, her breathing steady as she curled under the blanket. And Neri sat on the edge of the narrow bed, wearing Miles's shirt again, too large on her body, the fabric brushing her thighs with every shift as if reminding her she was wrapped in something that belonged to him. She hated the weakness of comfort, and yet could not take it off. Across the room, Miles sat with his back to the wall, tablet in hand, scrolling through ration logs with the same measured precision he applied to everything, and the steadiness of him, the way he neither rushed nor fidgeted, frayed her more than chaos ever had. Finally she broke the silence, voice low and edged. "Every man I've met has wanted something. Some demanded it at once, some waited until I was too tired to fight. What makes you different?" Miles set the tablet aside and looked at her without flinching. "Discipline," he said evenly, "and choice. I'd rather wait for what's freely given than take what leaves scars." The bluntness rattled her, because it left no space for bargaining, no mask to peel back. She pushed further, anger and fear tangling. "And if I never give you anything?" His reply came steady, immediate. "Then you never do." No hesitation, no shadow of hunger in his gaze, only truth spoken like a ledger entry. The steadiness unnerved her, because cruelty she could fight, but this quiet refusal to demand left her unarmed. She rose, crossed to the counter under pretense of checking the burner, but really to test whether his eyes would follow. They did, steady but not devouring, an acknowledgement rather than possession. "You don't turn away," she murmured, fingers gripping the edge of the counter. "Even when you know I hate being looked at." He didn't blink. "I don't turn you into something you're not," he said. "You're a woman. You're a mother. You're still allowed to be seen." The words struck deeper than she wanted, and before she could stop herself, she asked, "Do you think I'm weak?" He rose slowly, each motion deliberate, stopping close enough that his presence warmed the air, but leaving her space to flee. "I think you survived what most couldn't. That isn't weakness." Her pulse hammered, her breath uneven, and when she whispered, "And what do you see when you look at me now?" his answer came without pause. A woman who hasn't been touched without cruelty. A woman who deserves to be. His hand lifted, slow, patient, giving her time to refuse, fingers brushing her chin with a restraint so careful it felt heavier than force. Her body tensed, waiting for the demand that always followed, but it never came. When she pulled back, his hand fell away at once. No struggle, no bargaining, only release, and that simple act undid her more than violence ever had. She stood there trembling, caught between fear and the hunger to believe him, and from the bed Len murmured in her sleep, "Mama, he's safe." The words landed like a stone in still water, breaking every defense Neri clung to, and she turned away, whispering to herself, "She needs me," as if it were armor, but Miles only nodded, stepped back, and returned to his mat on the floor without protest. For the first time in months, she did not fear a man forcing himself on her. She feared what might happen if she stopped resisting. The third morning came quiet, no storm, no clang of collapsing scrap, only the faint hiss of water heating on the burner and the steady hum of the hydroponics, casting their pale green glow across the small room. And Neri woke with Len pressed warm against her side, cheeks no longer hollow, breath even, and for the first time in months, her first thought was not, "Is she still alive?" but "How long can this last?" She rose, the oversized shirt slipping against her thighs, and found Miles already moving through his routines, sleeves rolled, measuring routes with practiced calm, and the sight unsettled her more than chaos ever had, because it offered not survival but permanence, a rhythm that whispered of tomorrow. Over breakfast, when he set bowls before them without question, and ate from the same pot, she asked the words that had gnawed at her since the storm. "What happens when someone notices us here?" "People like you aren't supposed to keep strays." He met her eyes without flinching. "Then we adapt quietly. I won't let the spire decide for us. Not you, but us." The word lodged in her chest like a spark, dangerous because it suggested belonging. She tested him again, voice sharp to hide the tremor. "And if waiting makes me weaker? If wanting you feels like losing control?" He rose, slow, deliberate, shadow falling across her, but presence never pressing. "You don't lose control by choosing," he said. "You lose it when you're forced." Her hand lifted before she could stop it, brushing the fabric of his shirt, heat beneath startling her, and when she pulled back, his hand caught hers only lightly. No grip, only touch. "If this is too much, say it," he murmured. Her throat tightened. "And if it isn't?" His gray eyes steady, voice low. "Then I stay here and wait for you to move closer." The room thickened with silence heavier than storms, her pulse loud in her ears, pride and fear warring against the hunger to be seen. And finally she exhaled, words trembling but true. "I want it." His hands lifted slowly, brushing her cheek, steady at her waist, his restraint dissolving every defense she had clung to. And when she leaned into him, their lips met in a kiss not of possession, but of choice, deliberate and unhurried, the kind of touch that made her knees weak, not from fear, but from relief. When they broke apart, she whispered, "No one has ever touched me like that," and he rested his forehead against hers. "Then let this be the first time of many." Later, when they lay together on the narrow bed, Len between them, the girl's small hand resting on his arm as if it belonged there, Neri watched the rise and fall of his chest in the dim glow and understood the truth she had been fighting. They were no longer three broken survivors scraping against the shadow of Drexela's spire. They were a family, chosen and defiant, their unity itself a rebellion against a system that called compassion waste. And as the hydroponic trays hummed softly, and the city above droned on in its indifferent order, Neri realized the most shocking truth of all, that safety was no longer something she feared, but something she had claimed, one choice at a time. The days that followed bled into a rhythm that should have frightened Neri, but instead began to erode her armor. The Junkyard storms replaced by the steady cadence of Miles's routines. Water heating at dawn, ration logs checked at midday, hydroponic trays tended in the quiet hours when the spire's glow dimmed above. And though she told herself each night it was temporary, each morning she woke to her daughter's steady breathing and the warmth of a blanket that did not stink of smoke. And the lie of only for now grew harder to hold. Len grew stronger first, her cough thinning to nothing, her thin frame filling with cautious energy as she trailed after Miles, asking blunt questions in the way only children could. And though Neri bristled at each exchange, she could not deny the way her daughter's eyes carried a brightness she had not seen since the enclave fell. Still, unease gnawed at her. Safety had always been a prelude to betrayal, and the longer Miles held to his rules, no guests, food shared, no touch without choice, the sharper her suspicion became. For no man stayed consistent this long without eventually revealing the hunger beneath. That revelation came not in cruelty, but in a confession that left her breathless. One evening, as Len slept curled under her blanket, Miles set aside his tablet, looked at Neri with the same steady calm, and said, "You should know. I've been falsifying reports for months. Every surplus shipment marked spoiled. Every crate logged as waste. I've diverted it down to the yards." Neri's stomach tightened, because it meant his defiance began long before he found them, that his rebellion was not born of pity for her, but of conviction, and the risk of it was staggering. If the spire discovered, he would lose more than his position. He would vanish, like so many others swallowed by the system's silence. "Why tell me this?" she demanded, half in anger, half in awe. His answer was simple, terrifying in its clarity, because family deserves truth. And whether you choose it or not, that's what we are now. The words struck harder than any hand, because they named aloud the thing she had been too afraid to let herself believe. She wanted to deny it, to shove him away, but when she looked at Len asleep between them, her small hand curled around his wrist as if claiming it, Neri felt the last of her defenses falter. For months she had lived only for tomorrow, each day a gamble against hunger and violence. But here, in the warm hum of a single room beneath the spire, she realized she was no longer surviving. She was choosing. And in that choice lay the most shocking truth of all, that their rebellion was not in blades or fire, but in the audacity of calling themselves a family in a world that wanted them to remain scraps.